Welcome students, Storytime is back. Just in case you were wondering, today is the 1413th anniversary where Heraclius just strolled inside of Constantinople, cut the head off of the Emperor Phocas and became the Emperor himself, and ended up ruling for over 30 years as one of the more prominent emperors of the Byzantine Empire. What an absolute gigachad. Now, talking about gigachads, today we have a few of them remaining untouched by Blizzard's nerfs in the PTR. However, we also have quite a few other changes in our PTR. This is, I believe, our fourth round of tuning on the PTR for 10.2. And we have some quite interesting changes to the specs. We were waiting for some of the specs to be addressed by Blizzard in some of their issues or their problems. Some of them received attention, some of them did not. So let's start with the main set of changes for the week, which is of course the continued set of tuning for the rework of Demon Hunter. This week the primary set of tuning goes to Havoc over Vengeance. So of the set of changes, you have the general 3 of Demon Hunter receiving some changes, some general changes, where of course the major one is that Fodder to the Flame and Unleashed Power have now been removed. So if you go to the Demon Hunter 3, you find that Fodder to the Flame, previously moved over here, is now gone. Now you have Collective Anguish as a choice. Some of the other changes are, interesting to point out, like Chaos Nova having a lower cooldown for your AoE CC. You have the new talent Champion of the Glaive to give Throw Glaive 2 charges and 10 yards of increased range. But the major change, of course, is the removal of Fodder to the Flame. Interesting changes happen in the actual talent tree of Havoc. As Blizzard is pointing out, many talents have changed locations or have been combined into choice nodes. We have a few interesting ones across all of this. One is, for example, that Fell Barrage now has a max duration of 8 seconds instead of being uncapped like Breath of Sindragosa, and the Fury cost per volley has been reduced to 8 instead of 15, but in return the damage has also been nerfed of Fell Barrage. Some of the major changes in this talent tree include, for one, as you can see here, now you have a almost full set of dual choice nodes in the first row of your last bracket. Allows you to basically move around quite freely in this set. But as you can see from the talent tree, in the first mock-up of the Havoc Demon Hunter, we have quite the emptiness in the middle. The emptiness in the middle comes from the fact that now you still have this entire talent row for your inertia/momentum, which is going to be likely a must take. And then something we mentioned the last time we looked at Havoc. We had a fire inside, a very powerful new talent added to give you one more Immolation Aura charge, and on top of that, a 30% chance to not consume Immolation Aura, which used to be here. Instead, now it has been fully moved down this side of the talent tree, which is much better, because this side is the AoE heavy, the AoE intensive side, while this talent you want to take in both AoE and single target. So now that you moved it away from this side of the tree, it's much easier for you, even when you want to go and have a single target build, to take this very powerful talent. The other things are that now Chaotic Disposition, surprisingly for now at least, has not been nerfed by Blizzard. This continues to be a very well-performing talent for Havoc Demon Hunter, and because this side of the tree has the very powerful combo of Growing Inferno and Ragefire, this is taken very often. This is taken very often, which is resulting in the central part of the talent tree being less likely to be taken. Quite a few talents, of course, centered around I-Beam duration, the I-Beam haste buff, the I-Beam cooldown reduction. At the moment, I-Beam is losing a lot of value in the Havoc rotation, so it's not being focused in the talent tree. There are also a few changes to Vengeance, but these are more straightforward because they are simple buffs. You have basically damage buffs across the board to Vengeance, and a few other buffs like 100% more healing from Feast of Souls. You have more damage reduction from Fell Fortification. You have less cooldown to Bulk Extraction. You have higher Soul Barrier Absorb. So for Vengeance is a more straightforward set of positive changes instead of the ones for Havoc, which are, you know, talent repositionings in their specific talent tree. After Demon Hunter, you have Druid. Druid has a couple of simple changes, really. For balance, it's a set of buffs. You have Star Surge damage increased by 6%, and then Shooting Stars damage increased by 15%. So it's a very minor set of changes for balance. What is perhaps slightly bigger is the change to Guardian. The change to Guardian compared to their original tier is that the original tier created the Absorb Shield of the 2-piece based on 20% of your damage and healing done and 100% of the armor you were gaining. Now instead, this Absorb Shield is gained by the rage you spend. At the moment this is bugged, it's not working as intended, so it's quite hard to know if this is better or if this is worse in terms of numbers compared to the older version of this tier set, but in terms of quality of life, it is definitely much better. You are going to be benefiting regardless of what you're doing, regardless of whether or not you were spending rage, a lot of it, or less, if you were doing a lot of damage, or if you were gaining a lot of armor with Iron Fur. That was impacting how powerful the shield was going to be. Now instead, doesn't matter. Now instead, it all benefits from you spending rage, which is basically what you do all the time as a Guardian Druid. So in terms of the power of the tier, we don't know yet because the numbers are probably not fixed in the PTR at the moment, but in terms of quality of life, in terms of how it functions, it's better for Guardian. The 4-piece set bonus, the fact that now the Absorb Shield is capped at 100% of maximum health, will not matter in about 99% of your scenarios. You will never get to a point where you can get such a large shield because you're fighting 30 different mobs and generating massive amounts of shields, especially because if you're fighting 30 mobs, you're also taking a lot of damage, meaning the shield gets constantly depleted, so it's not really gonna have that big of an effect with this change for Guardian. Then we have something we have touched on already for Augmentation yesterday in the Augmentation specific video, which is the change for Blizzard that attempts to make Augmentation Evoker not stack nearly as many buffs on the same target. I am saying attempts, but basically it forces you, because now if 2 Ebon Mites are already active on an ally, Ebon Mite will now seek a nearby ally instead, and the same treatment is given to Prescience. So now effectively you cannot stack any more than 2 buffs on the same target. That is basically the main change in this PTR tuning. The other one is a quality of life change. The 4-piece set bonus, now your extra damage buff will allow to stack and to overlap. Why? Because this tier used to buff your damage based on you applying Prescience. So casting Prescience enhances your next eruption. But there is a problem. In 10.2, you now have 2 stacks of Prescience, which means you can cast Prescience twice in a row. So casting Prescience twice in a row was overwriting this buff. You weren't benefiting from this twice because you were casting Prescience twice. So instead now it allows you to stack the buff if you're casting multiple Presciences. Hunter, we were waiting, talking about, expecting some of the specs to receive changes. One of them was marksmanship. Given that marksmanship right now is doing quite poorly, absolutely 0 changes to marksmanship. We do have a quality of life for Beast Mastery. Now the bonus pets from Call of the Wild will spawn right next to your target rather than by your side, meaning you don't have to wait for a couple of seconds for those pets to wake up and start dashing to the enemy. It's a minor positive change. Same goes for Survival. The empowerment buff from your coordinated assault cooldown now lasts for 5 seconds instead of 3. Overall, a disappointment since we don't see any further marksmanship changes. Nothing really that relevant for Arcane besides a bunch of fixes, and as a result, nothing else for the rest of the Mage specs. Brewmaster gets the same treatment as Guardian. The 4-piece set bonus now has a stagger absorb value capped at 100% of maximum health. This is also something that, rarely happens with your Celestial Brew to be able to have an average cast of Celestial Brew to be above your max HP. So also, same for Guardian, this is very unlikely to ever matter for you as a tank. We then have changes to Mistweaver. This is more relevant because number 1, Rising Sun Kick is now granted by default, and number 2, the location of Healing Elixir and Zen Pulse has swapped. This is interesting because they have essentially swapped next to each other, and also at the moment Mistweaver monks are using both of these talents in Mythic Plus, but they're also using neither of these talents in the raid. Swapping their positions at the moment doesn't seem to have that big of an effect. We will see if the talent build in 10.2 changing for Mistweaver might be impacted by this talent swap in positions for Mistweaver. We were perhaps also hoping for some positive changes for Protection Paladin, which wasn't doing nearly as well on the PTR. We actually get nothing on the PTR for protection. We are getting something for Shadow Priest, however. This change is explained quite well by Blizzard in what their plan is. Surge of Insanity now triggers from every 2 casts of the Warring Plague. This is the change coming in the PTR. At the moment, in live, Surge of Insanity happens all the time. In the PTR, it was instead going to happen every 3 casts, which was going to be quite slow. So now Blizzard is bringing it back to proc from every 2 casts. They are stating that, the shadow rotation has slowed down more than we were intending from our changes. So what they are doing is giving you this proc every 2 casts instead of every 3, and they're also buffing the insanity generated by Mind Spike and the insanity generated by Mind Flake to speed up your rotation. In return, however, they are also nerfing your tier set across the board. Your 2-piece set bonus now has the extra Shadow Word Deaths triggering at 20% effectiveness instead of 35. This used to be 50. It was then nerfed to 35. It's now been nerfed down to 20. You then also have diminishing returns damage, the additional Shadow Word Deaths from the set. Now deal reduced inescapable torment damage. And now the 4-piece also receives a counter change. There is a buff in AoE and a nerf in single target. The Shadow Word Pain stacking damage goes to 200% per stack instead of 250, while the AoE one, Shadow Crash, goes to 100% damage extra per stack instead of 50. At the very least, despite the nerfs in the power of the tier set, which was already a very strong tier set for Shadow Priest, at least now your rotation in terms of insanity generation and procs of Surge of Insanity has been made smoother compared to what it was before on the PTR. No Discipline, no Holy. Interesting, especially given that Holy right now is quite weak on the PTR. It's another spec we were waiting to see some changes of in this set of tuning. We don't, so we move over to Rogue. Rogue gets triple change on all 3 specs. Worst change of the week. Exsanguinate has been renamed to Sanguine Blade. I'm not a fan. I liked Exsanguinate as a name, so I'm not supporting this new weak-ass name for the ability. They are changing something that might perhaps be a little bit counterintuitive. The tier set bonus now deals reduced damage beyond 5 targets. Now this is somewhat confusing, of course, because the tier set bonus is here. So, nerfing this tier set bonus seems counterintuitive given the little damage it does, and even if it was doing high damage, it's still AoE, which is still the weakest part of the assassination toolkit, even in the PTR. Even after a rework, they are still weak. The entire point of this ability, this effect, was to allow you to use a single target ability, Envenom, to splash AoE damage around you. Which makes sense. Your only AoE spender at assassination is Crimson Tempest, which is a dot. You don't want to spam this non-stop, like you would spam Black Powder for subtlety. You want to cast it once and then go on to spam Envenom to splash AoE damage. This AoE splashing damage wasn't doing too well, and now it's being essentially further nerfed by having diminishing return past 5 targets. At the very least, they are buffing the base damage of your Envenom. So the base damage of the single target finisher itself is increased, which means this is going to be stronger as long as you're not fighting more than 5 targets in AoE. Outlaw, another spec we wanted to look at because it was OP in the PTR, so we wanted to see some significant nerfs. The nerfs are here, but they are not nearly as much as we were expecting. Triple Threat, the chance to get an extra attack with Sinister Strike has been increased to 15% instead of 10. Count the odds, the chance to get the extra dice in your Roll the Bones has been reduced to 8% instead of 10, but can now also be triggered by Sinister Strike. So instead of just Ambush and Dispatch having a now 8% chance to grant you a Roll the Bones combat enhancement, now it's an 80% chance with Sinister Strike as well. Don't forget, the duration and chance are doubled while stealthed, and nowadays your run-of-the-mill Outlaw Rogue is in stealth every time. So effectively, it's a 16% chance to get an extra Roll the Bones combat enhancement, which is very good still for Outlaw. And then you have some other nerfs, but still not nearly as impactful. Hidden Opportunity effectiveness of the chance to strike twice has been reduced to 80% instead of 100. But again, this is a very minor change. Many of the major powers of Outlaw, like for example underhanded upper hand talent, those are still at the moment untouched. That is what is keeping a lot of their power at the moment on the PTR, so if you were fearing some major nerfs to Outlaw, you got away easy in this PTR. Subtlety receives much fewer changes. There is a buff to the Rotten damage as well as a buff to Shadow Strike, but not much else. Elemental and Restoration both receive changes, and they were both expected. The change to Elemental is a nerf. The set bonus where Primordial Wave now causes your next 2 Lava Burst casts to strike extra targets instead of 3. We discussed what was the problem with this fight when we looked over the Council fight, the Mythic Council fight after the change to the tier set of Elemental. And we saw that the result of allowing Elemental to machine gun 3 different enemies with Lava Burst created some problems to the damage of the spec. So now this thing right here is going to be not nearly as broken on multi-target situations where they can cleave with Lava Burst. So this was somewhat expected. Same expectation for Restoration, where Chain healing has been increased by 20%. The reason for this significant buff to Chain Heal is also something we mentioned when we were looking at the logs of healers, looking at Resto Shamans, where Resto Shamans were playing a somewhat boring whack-a-mole game of essentially just spamming Healing Wave and Riptide. Look at this, we live in a world where you are casting more Healing Waves than Riptides even in a raid, and then Chain Heal just becomes so weak that there is no point in even trying. Look at this, 1 Healing Wave heals on average for 192k, and 1 Chain Heal, which is supposed to be an AoE spell, heals for 189. It's weaker than your single target. That's why it was being ignored. So with this 20% buff, now you have way more incentive to go back to at least consider Chain Heal more. That's because in your tier set as a Shaman, you have your direct healing spell that can spread and tag your players with Tidal Reservoir, which are Chain Heal, Healing Surge and Healing Wave. And because at the moment Chain Heal was the weakest one, it just wasn't being cast. With this 20% buff, you are more likely to go back at playing around with Chain Heal, at least some of the times. Then we have a very simple buff to arms, just flat out all abilities increased by 6% in damage. Very flat and simple. Arms wasn't doing too well on the PTR. We also have a very flat set of buffs to Destro. Summon Infernal damage increased by 50%, and then Shadowburn damage increased by 15%. Also not doing too well. Then we have the major set of changes again to Demo. The explanation of Blizzard is quite simple. Caustic Presence is doing exceedingly well in single target situation, even though the talent itself is supposed to be for AoE. Because Caustic Presence is a very powerful tool in AoE already. You know, Summon Vilefilm with its Caustic Presence is just doing a lot of now free damage you previously didn't have after the buffs given to Summon Vilefield in the last round of tuning in the PTR. So Blizzard now is nerfing the damage of Caustic Presence by 50%. They are giving in return some other buffs. Now Pit Lord benefits from your haste, the Pit Lord benefits from your crit, the damage of the Fellseeker of the Pit Lord is increased by 30%. You now have Doombrand, your tier set damage, dealing 150% more damage, and the Doomfiend spawned by Doombrand has its AoE increased by 150%. So it's an attempt at a trade-off, at weakening the damage of this passive effect around your Vilefiend. That's the major change for Demo. So with demo done, we have run through all of the specs being changed in here. As I said, some were expected, some we were waiting for, like Restoration Shaman, like Elemental Shaman, a couple of the changes around Assassination Rogue, around Shadow Priest as well. But then some others we were still, expecting something more, Holy Priest is not being mentioned, we have Protection Paladin not being mentioned, we have no nerfs, no significant nerfs for Outlaw. Fire Mage, even, we might be expecting something for Fire Mage as well. Still nothing. However, it's still good that we are now going through at a pretty stable pace of changes. Now, roughly once a week, we are getting a decent amount of changes in the PTR, so it's a good thing that we're gonna have perhaps 3-4 more of these set of changes before 10.2 goes live. But for now, these are all of the planned changes going live on the PTR to be testable for everyone who wants to try out any of these tuning changes for the specs. So with this out of the way, we're gonna leave each other on this Thursday, I believe, starting with our goodbyes to all of our Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, which, as usual, don't worry, if you lack the currency, you can still give it completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. So, with these things out of the way, we are now saying goodbye to each other. Thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, well, the video ended up being a bit longer than I thought. I was thinking we can do this in 15 minutes easy. I went overboard again.